Jacob Hayes jolted awake, his heart racing and sweat trickling down his back. The stillness of the old farmhouse wrapped around him like a thick blanket. But it was the sound, the low, rhythmic thudding, coming from the fields that pulled him from his restless slumber. Disoriented, he staggered out of bed and stumbled to his bedroom's second-floor window. The moon hung low in the sky, its cold light illuminating the vast, sprawling cornfield. Shadows danced among the corn stalks, and he squinted into the darkness, trying to discern the shapes that lurked just beyond the moonlight. As he focused, he caught sight of them, the Scarecrows. 5 figures stood sentinel among the rows, their burlap faces painted with wide, eerie smiles, with a luminescence that seemed to emanate from them, staring, unblinking, into the night. Suddenly the figures shifted. Their movements were slow and jerky, like marionettes tangled in their own strings, flickering in and out of the moon's glow. Jacob's breath caught in his throat. Were they watching him? He stumbled back from the window, feeling a cold sweat break across his skin. Weeks earlier, Jacob had arrived at the Barrett farm, hoping for a fresh start. The land had been incredibly cheap. Too cheap, he thought. But he had no other options. The farmhouse stood solemnly at the edge of a vast, empty cornfield with 5 scarecrows positioned at intervals throughout the corn. Their faces, crudely painted, seemed to shift with the wind almost as if they were alive. Mr. Barrett, the previous owner, had insisted on leaving the Scarecrows behind, speaking of them as if they were old friends. "They watch over the fields. They'll do me no good where I'm going," he had said, his voice carrying a strange reverence. Jacob had shrugged off the man's strange attachment to these figures, thinking little of them as he began to work the land. The first few days were spent clearing the fields and preparing for planting, but something felt off. At night, the air grew thick with an unsettling quiet, broken only by the creaking of the old house. Jacob could swear he heard whispers in the wind, soft and unintelligible, sending shivers down his spine. Disheartening for a man alone in a field at night, Jacob shook off the feeling and returned to his homestead, the home he had hoped he could raise a family in one day. As the days turned into weeks, Jacob began to notice strange occurrences. He found odd shapes in the field, straw strewn about in peculiar patterns, as if something had been moving through the corn stalks at night. And the Scarecrows, they seemed to shift positions. One day he could swear that one had moved a few feet closer to the farmhouse. Despite his best efforts, he could not shake the feeling that he was being watched. The Scarecrows, with their unsettling smiles and lifeless eyes, felt more like sentinels than simple figures meant to scare off birds. Every time he glanced away, he could almost feel them shift, closing the distance between them. Then came the whispers. Faint at first, like echoes of laughter carried on the wind, Jacob could stand in the field, tools in hand, and hear them flutter past his ears, just out of reach. He shook his head, trying to dismiss the sounds as figments of his imagination, yet they gnawed at his sanity. As night fell, shadows lengthened, stretching across the wood floorboards of the farmhouse. Each creak of the wood felt amplified in the oppressive silence. Jacob found himself retreating to his bed earlier and earlier each night, clutching a lantern as if it could ward off the dark. One evening, as he prepared to sleep, he caught a glimpse of movement outside. Peering through the window, he noticed the Scarecrows arranged in a neat row, their heads tilted at angles as if engaged in silent conversation. A chill crawled through his spine, but he shrugged it off, convincing himself that it was merely the wind. Sleep eluded him that night. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the whispers growing louder, more insistent. It was as if the house itself breathed with him, its walls alive with secrets he couldn't comprehend. Finally, he drifted off, but his dreams were twisted. filled with images of the scarecrows gliding through the corn, their eyes glowing, beckoning him to join their morbid dance. One particularly sleepless night, Jacob awoke to a sound that sent ice through his veins, a rhythmic rustling from the cornfield. Curiosity overcame his fear, and he crept to the window, peering out into the darkness. The moon illuminated the field, revealing the scarecrows gathered in a circle, their jerky movements more pronounced under the pale light. It was as if they were engaging in some twisted ritual. Jacob's heart raced as he realized they were huddled over something on the ground. Straining to see, he made out the shape of a deer, its form lifeless and still. As he watched in horror, the scarecrows began to jerk and twitch, their burlap faces grimacing in an exaggerated show of hunger. Their arms reached out, fingers clawing at the air as they moved rhythmically, almost in a dance. Jacob felt a wave of nausea wash over him. He stepped back from the window, his heart pounding. What kind of sick game was this? He fought to convince himself that he had imagined it, that the fatigue was warping his mind. But sleep remained elusive. The next night, he braved the dark once more, leaning against the window frame, hoping to dispel the horror he had witnessed. The sight was even more grotesque. The scarecrows had dragged the deer into a clearing, their movements slow and deliberate, as if savoring every moment. He could see their jagged, painted-on smiles split wide as they feasted, straw spilling from their grinning mouths. The moonlight glinted off something sharp in their hands, something that made Jacob's stomach turn. Desperation clawed at Jacob's mind. He could no longer ignore the menace lurking among the cornstalks. Determined to rid himself of the scarecrows, he decided to burn the fields. Armed with a canister of kerosene, he poured a trail along the edge of the cornfield and struck a match. Flames roared to life, licking at the dry stalks, sending sparks into the air. Jacob felt a rush of exhilaration as the fire spread, devouring the dark remnants of the field. But as the fire consumed the corn, a chilling sight stopped him cold. The scarecrows, those damned scarecrows, slid down from their poles, their movements disjointed and unnatural, as if the fire had animated them. Jacob stumbled back, the warmth of the blaze turning to a cold dread as the figures approached him, their movements jerky and erratic. Even as the flames roared, the scarecrows seemed untouched, standing defiantly in the inferno's glow. Jacob watched in disbelief as they remained intact, charred but upright, their eerie smiles unwavering. That night, as the fire burned down to embers, Jacob found himself unable to escape the sensation of eyes on him. He retreated to the farmhouse, locking every door and window, praying that the inferno had driven the horrors away. But as he lay in bed, every creak of the house became a reminder of his vulnerability. Nights passed, with Jacob unable to sleep, each one filled with nightmares of the scarecrows closing in on him. Shadows danced along the walls of the farmhouse, whispering secrets he could not understand. He became a prisoner of his own home, unable to escape the feeling that he was being watched, not just from the fields, but from the very walls around him. His mind frayed as paranoia set in. Every creak of the old house, every whisper of the wind felt like a warning. He found himself jumping at shadows, convinced the scarecrows had taken on a life of their own, stalking him in the dark. One night, while sitting in the dim glow of an oil lamp, Jacob noticed something out of the corner of his eye. He turned to see a figure standing just beyond the window, its outline barely discernible in the darkness. He gasped, realizing it was one of the scarecrows, its head cocked to the side, watching him. Driven by a sudden surge of rage and fear, Jacob lunged for the door, throwing it open with a crash, but the field lay empty. The scarecrows nowhere in sight. He felt the ground tremble beneath him as if it pulsed with a sinister energy. The whispers grew louder, filling his ears with mocking laughter. One night, pushed to the brink of insanity, Jacob could take it no longer. He stormed out of the farmhouse, determined to confront the Scarecrows once and for all. Grabbing a pitchfork, he marched into the field, the moonlight casting long shadows over the burnt remains. As he neared the charred figures, they began to sway, their movements slow and deliberate. The moonlight flickered, and for a moment they seemed to blink in and out of existence. Jacob's breath quickened as he raised the pitchfork, ready to drive it through the nearest Scarecrow's heart. But as he lunged forward, the figures surged to life, their jagged movements catching him off guard. With a terrifying grace, they glided toward him. Faces twisted into grotesque smiles that seemed to widen beyond the bounds of reality. The air thickened with dread, a palpable weight pressing down on Jacob as he faced the horrors he had unleashed. The pitchfork trembled in his hands, and for a moment he hesitated, realizing the futility of his actions. No matter how he fought, the Scarecrows were unaffected, their forms now surrounded by a malevolent aura that seemed to suck the warmth from the night. "Stay away!" he shouted, desperation crackling in his voice as he swung the pitchfork wildly. But they merely sidestepped his attack with an unnatural fluidity. Their jerky movements synchronized in a twisted dance that mocked his attempt to resist. Suddenly, the largest Scarecrow, its burlap head adorned with tattered remnants of clothing, stepped closer. Jacob stumbled back, tripping over a patch of burned earth. The thing leaned in, its painted grin splitting wide to reveal a maw of jagged teeth, a horrific mockery of what had once been straw and fabric. "Join us," it whispered, its voice a haunting echo that slithered through the air like smoke. "We have been waiting for you." Jacob screamed, a primal sound that reverberated through the empty field, but the noise only seemed to amuse the Scarecrows. They closed in around him, their movements slow and deliberate, as if savoring his terror. Each figure advanced with purpose, their heads tilting in unison, their painted smiles unwavering. As Jacob backed away, his mind raced with thoughts of escape, but every path led back to those grotesque figures. Their eyes, black holes of emptiness, seeming to swallow the light. The whispers grew louder, a cacophony or symphony of taunts and laughter, enveloping him in a haze of despair. "Fear feeds us," the figures chanted, their voices blending into a chilling harmony. "You cannot escape your fate." Panic surged through Jacob as he turned to flee, but the ground beneath him felt alive, shifting with every desperate step. He stumbled, falling to his knees as the Scarecrows encircled him, their movements now a blur of frantic jerks, closing the distance with inhuman speed. In that moment of utter despair, Jacob realized he was trapped in a waking nightmare, a realm where reality and madness blurred. He clawed at the earth, desperately trying to pull himself away, but the shadows closed in, engulfing him in darkness. As the moon rose high, casting an eerie glow over the field, Jacob found himself alone. The Scarecrows had vanished. Heart pounding, he scrambled to his feet and ran toward the farmhouse, every instinct screaming at him to escape. But the door slammed shut behind him, as if the house itself had decided to imprison him. Inside, he stumbled through the dim rooms, the oppressive silence broken only by the faint echoes of laughter that haunted his ears. The walls felt alive, pulsating with the remnants of the nightmare that had just consumed him. He pressed his back against the wall, breathless, straining to hear anything other than the echoes of his own heartbeat. Suddenly, he felt a draft, a chill sweeping through the room. A shadow flickered at the edge of his vision, and he turned, eyes wide with terror. The Scarecrows emerged from the corners, their forms illuminated by the flickering light of the oil lamp, grinning wider than ever. "Join us!" They sang in unison, their voices a cacophony that rattled the very foundations of the farmhouse. Jacob stumbled backward, desperate to escape, but the shadows thickened around him, each corner of the room swelling with the grotesque figures he had tried to outrun. In a final act of defiance, he lunged for the lantern, desperate to ignite the fire once more, but as he swung it toward the nearest scarecrow, the flame flickered and sputtered, the darkness swallowing its light. The figures advanced, their movements slow yet relentless, closing the distance with an unearthly grace. With nowhere to turn, Jacob collapsed to the floor, the lantern rolling away and extinguishing itself. The room fell into darkness, the shadows growing thicker, more oppressive. As the scarecrows loomed over him, he felt an inexplicable pull, an ancient force that bound them. "You cannot fight what you are," the largest scarecrow whispered, its voice dripping with an unholy allure. "You were always meant to join us." In that moment, Jacob understood. The whispers he had heard were not merely figments of his imagination. They were the voices of those who had come before him, farmers, dreamers, souls who had lost their way. He realized the scarecrows were not just figments of fear, but guardians of a cursed legacy, and he was now a part of it. As he surrendered to the darkness, the scarecrows enveloped him, their laughter echoing in his mind. He felt himself slipping away, the last remnants of his identity fading into the cold embrace of the field. The next morning, the sun rose over the Barrett farm, illuminating the field that had consumed Jacob Hayes. The charred remains of the corn stood like solemn sentinels, and the scarecrows remained, but now there were 6. Their painted smiles as unsettling as ever. As the new family arrived, drawn by the promise of a fertile land, they glanced at the scarecrows, witnesses to the horrors that had unfolded. Unbeknownst to them, the whispers of Jacob would carry on in the wind, welcoming them into the same dark embrace. And as the day faded into night, the scarecrows would shift and sway, their movements slow and jerky, always watching, always waiting for the next soul to claim. The legacy of the Barrett farm would continue, entwining the fates of all who dared to call it home. In the early 1800s, Elias Barrett, a farmer who had fled the darkness and struggles of Europe, arrived in a remote part of the United States with his wife, Helga, and their grown son, Anton. It was a time when the country was expanding westward and land was cheap for those willing to work it. When Elias found an open stretch of land surrounded by ancient woods, he believed he had stumbled upon his family's salvation. The soil seemed dark and rich, perfect for the crops he planned to plant. But as Elias and his family soon discovered, the land held more than the promise of a prosperous future. It held secrets that should never have been unearthed. Join me on this haunting tale and any of my other horror fictions by subscribing to the channel. I write all my own material and would be elated to have you join me on this quest to make some of the scariest stories around. Now, back to the terrifying tale of what would later become known as the Barrett farm. From the moment the first shovel struck the ground, there was a sense that something lay beneath the surface, something that shuddered when disturbed. The first few nights after breaking the earth, the family heard faint sounds, soft murmurs carried on the breeze, as if the soil itself whispered of ancient things that should have been left undisturbed. The sounds seemed to come from the fields, growing louder each night as the furrows deepened and the plows dug further into the earth. There was a strange heaviness in the air, a sensation like a slow breath exhaled from deep underground. Elias was not one to be easily frightened. He dismissed the whispers as tricks of the wind and the tension in his bones as nothing more than fatigue from a long day's work. But Anton felt differently. As he plowed the fields, he sometimes saw what looked like dark figures flickering in the distance. At the edges of his vision, just beyond the tree line. When he looked directly, there was nothing, just the waving tall grass and the thick trees swaying in the wind. The feeling lingered, though, a sense that they were not alone, that something old and unseen was watching. Then, one evening, the family dog, a loyal and spirited companion, went missing. They searched for days, calling its name until their voices were hoarse. Helga stayed up late, leaving the front lantern burning as a beacon, but when the dog finally returned, it was lifeless. Its fur matted and covered in dirt. There was a terrible wound on its side, as though something had taken a bite from it, but the edges of the wound were blackened, as if burned. Helga wept as Elias buried the dog behind the house. But even as he dug the grave, he could not shake the feeling that he was disturbing something best left untouched. The farm continued to resist them at every turn. The crops grew unnaturally, their leaves thick and dark but twisted and tangled, as though the plants themselves recoiled from the light of day. Even the old oak tree at the edge of the field seemed to bend lower, its branches reaching out like gnarled fingers toward the farmhouse. In an attempt to ward off bad luck, Elias fashioned a scarecrow. He took an old suit of clothes and stuffed it with straw, using a burlap sack for the head, which he stitched together with rough thread. He added a crude face, 2 uneven eyes, and a wide, crooked smile that was meant to frighten off birds, but only succeeded in unsettling the family. The scarecrow stood tall in the middle of the field, its button eyes gleaming in the moonlight like watchful guards. But as the days passed, the figure seemed to age quickly, as though the land was leeching the life from it. The burlap sagged, and its smile grew more grotesque with each passing night. There were times when Elias thought he saw it move. Just a slight shift, as if it was bending to whisper to the soil. He would shake his head and dismiss it as a trick of the eyes, but the whispers that seemed to emanate from the fields grew louder and clearer, as if the scarecrow was somehow listening to them or speaking to them. It was after the scarecrow's arrival that Anton began to change. He grew distant, his eyes hollow and ringed with shadows. He confessed to his father that he felt drawn to the scarecrow, that he could hear voices at night calling his name, telling him to come closer. Elias dismissed his son's fears as childish nonsense, but deep down, he knew something was wrong. One night, when the moon was nothing more than a thin crescent hanging in the sky, Anton vanished. Helga found his bed empty and his boots gone. They searched the fields, calling out in the dark, but their voices seemed to disappear into the night, swallowed up by the endless stretch of crooked crops and the thickening fog that rolled in from the woods. When they reached the scarecrow, Elias noticed something he hadn't before. The scarecrow's hands were no longer stuffed with straw, but appeared to be covered with a thin layer of mud, as though they had recently clawed their way out of the earth. Days turned into weeks, and Anton never returned. The farm grew quieter with a sadness, but there was an underlying hum that never ceased, a low vibration in the soil that seemed to resonate through the walls of the farmhouse, even in the dead of night. Helga swore she could hear Anton's voice at times, distant and muffled, as if calling to them from somewhere deep underground. The scarecrow, meanwhile, seemed to decay at an alarming rate. Its face grew darker, almost black, and its clothes hung in tatters, though no storm or rain had touched it. Then Elias began to dream. In these dreams, he found himself walking the fields under a blood-red sky, the air thick with the smell of decay. The scarecrow stood in the distance, its limbs twisted and jerking as if moving through some unseen force. Elias could see faces in the folds of its burlap head, shadows of people screaming in silent terror. One night, He woke to find himself standing in the middle of the field, mud clinging to his bare feet with no memory of how he even got there. The Scarecrow loomed in front of him, closer than it should have been, its crooked smile impossibly wide. It wasn't long after that Elias disappeared too. Helga awoke one morning to find his side of the bed cold, the front door hanging open, and muddy footprints trailing out into the fields. She searched for hours, but found nothing, only the empty fields and the Scarecrow, which now looked more lifelike than ever. The eyes were no longer buttons, they glistened wetly in the dim light, and the mouth seemed to twitch at the corners, almost as if it was trying to speak. The next day, a stranger came to the farm. He was a tall man with dark eyes and a voice like gravel, introducing himself as Gideon Thorn, a drifter who claimed to know about the land's history. He offered to help Helga with the farm to keep it running in Elias's absence. She was hesitant, but desperation made her accept. Thorn worked tirelessly, often at night, and took a particular interest in the Scarecrow, which he seemed to tend to more than the crops themselves. Sometimes Helga could watch him talking to it in low tones, his voice inches from the burlap head, and at those times she would retreat to the house, clutching a crucifix. Helga didn't last much longer. The whispers became too much for her to bear, the voices too real, too familiar. One morning, Thorn found her in the attic, her body cold and stiff. With her passing, the farm fell completely under Thorn's care, and he took to it as though it had always been his. The years turned into decades, and the farmhouse rotted away, yet Thorn remained. He never aged, and the Scarecrow never seemed to fully decay, no matter how many seasons passed. Whenever someone wandered onto the property, lured by stories of fertile soil and the promise of prosperity, Thorn was there, always watching, always smiling. Those who bought the land soon found the air thick with an unshakable gloom, and before long they would leave, abandoning the farm back to Thorn's strange stewardship. But with each new owner, there seemed to be another Scarecrow erected. They would appear overnight, fashioned from old clothes and burlap, their forms slumping over in the fields like silent sentries. And with each Scarecrow, the whispers grew louder, the voices more desperate, like something beneath the earth was slowly clawing its way up. In the late 1800s, Jacob Hayes bought the land. Unlike those before him, he dismissed the old tales of the cursed farm as nonsense. Thorn, ever the friendly caretaker, welcomed him with open arms, even offering to stay on and help manage the land. "It's a good place," Thorn assured Jacob, "as long as you keep the Scarecrows up." Jacob passed on the offer. Jacob took the land at a price that seemed almost too good to be true. Thorn left not long after, but the air felt heavier in his absence, and Jacob found himself haunted by strange dreams, just as Elias had been. It wasn't long before the whispers began again, drifting up from the ground like mist, carrying voices that called out names Jacob didn't recognize, but always ended with his own. Years passed, and the land lay mostly untouched, as if the very soil itself had grown tired of devouring those who dared to claim it. In modern times, developers finally saw the potential in the old farm, believing they could turn it into a new suburban neighborhood. They cleared the fields and began construction, tearing down the decaying farmhouse and uprooting the old Scarecrows, which had somehow survived the passage of all this time. As they dug deeper, the excavator struck something solid just below the surface. They unearthed a shallow grave filled with human bones, some old, others disturbingly recent. The remains were twisted and broken, as if the bodies had been forced into the earth by something stronger than nature itself. The discovery should have halted the work immediately, but there was an eagerness to develop the land, to cast away its dark history with concrete and steel. But as the workers continued their excavation, something else emerged. A sense of being watched, a coldness that seemed to seep up from the ground itself. It was subtle at first, a chill that hung in the air. Then the feeling grew sharper, like a pair of unseen eyes observing every movement. The workers soon noticed the scarecrows standing on the edge of the construction site, half buried in the overgrown grass. No one remembered them being placed there. They had been moved far from the fields for disposal. But here they were, leaning in the mist like gaunt, silent figures watching over a shallow grave. The scarecrows were unsettlingly detailed. Their button eyes seemed to gleam wetly in the fog, and the fabric that had once been dull and worn appeared darker, as if stained with something fresh. Some of the workers swore they saw the scarecrows shift when they turned their backs, a subtle leaning or twitching of a hand. But when they looked closer, the scarecrows were always perfectly still. One worker went missing on the third day of digging. The others found his shovel lying near the freshly dug grave, but no trace of him remained, not even a single footprint leading away. The scarecrows seemed to loom even closer, their crooked burlap faces slack with gaping mouths and hollow eyes. The workers grew uneasy, and whispers spread that the land was cursed, that something old and evil had been awakened when they broke the ground. The next night a thick fog rolled in, much heavier than any before, engulfing the construction site in a suffocating shroud. As visibility faded to almost nothing, one of the workers stumbled back toward his truck after a late shift. His flashlight beam cut through the haze, catching glimmers of movement just at the edge of the light. He swung the beam around and saw a dark shape, a scarecrow, half seen through the mist, standing much closer than he remembered. He walked faster, his breath coming in panicked gasps, and glanced over his shoulder. The scarecrow was closer still, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. Suddenly, he heard a rustling behind him, like the dry scratch of straw dragging along the ground. He turned to face the noise and saw it. The scarecrow had moved. It was no longer bound by the stake that should have held it upright. It slumped forward as if walking, its joints creaking with the strain of movement. He screamed, but his voice seemed swallowed by the fog. And when the other workers found him the next morning, he was curled up at the edge of the construction site, his hair gone white and his eyes wide open, staring unblinking at the place where the scarecrow had stood. The developers called the local authorities and work on the site was halted, but the scarecrows continued to appear, arranged around the shallow grave like mourners at a funeral. Each time they were removed, they would return with strange new details, a piece of fabric that looked like the torn sleeve of a worker's uniform, or a burlap face twisted into a grimace that seemed disturbingly human. The construction company brought in a local historian to examine the bones, and as he sifted through the soil, he unearthed relics that told a grim story. Rusted tools, fragments of a wooden cross, and the remains of what looked like a crude burial shroud made from burlap. Among the artifacts was an old ledger, pages half rotted but still legible enough to reveal names and dates. The last entry, dated back to the late 1800s, was written in a shaky hand and read, "Jacob Hayes, purchaser of the Barrett farm." As the historian continued his research, he uncovered rumors from decades past, stories about the land changing hands frequently, with every new owner fleeing within weeks, leaving behind fields choked with weeds and abandoned homes slowly falling apart. Those who lived nearby told of strange figures seen wandering the fields at dusk, shapes that seemed to be stitched together with rags and old clothes, with faces as pale as burlap. Then the historian found something even more chilling, a mention of a caretaker named Gideon Thorn, who had lived on the property for as long as anyone could remember. It was said he rarely aged and was always present whenever the land changed hands, offering his services to each new owner with a smile that never reached his eyes. Some speculated that he was not a man at all, but something else entirely, a spirit bound to the land, a keeper of secrets that should have been buried forever. When the historian relayed his findings to the developers, he was met with skepticism. But then came the final horror. One morning, the shallow grave was found disturbed, the earth freshly churned. Inside the pit, the bones were rearranged, and at the very center lay the historian's broken body, his mouth stuffed with straw and his hands tied with frayed burlap. The scarecrows, which had been removed just the day before, now stood in a perfect circle surrounding the grave, their faces all turned toward the farmhouse ruins as if awaiting something. The authorities closed the site indefinitely, and no one dared to approach the old farm again. It remains untouched, surrounded by a rusting wire fence and a tangled thicket of weeds. The scarecrows still stand at the perimeter, their cloth bodies worn thin by the wind, but their faces remain disturbingly intact, gazing out over the cursed land. Locals say that if you walk by at dusk, you can still see them shifting slightly in the breeze, and some swear they can hear a faint whisper on the wind, a voice calling out names in the dark, always ending with Jacob Hayes. And no one knows what became of Gideon Thorn, but some say a shadowy figure can still be seen wandering the edge of the woods, watching over the land that has consumed so many souls. Others claim that the scarecrows now serve as his sentinels, their hollow eyes watching and waiting for the next unfortunate soul to trespass on the ground that should have remained forever untouched. He looked out at the horizon, the bright red sky touching the green fields before him, the tall grass now casting an eerie glow from the tips of the leaves. The setting sun intensified with flickering light, the smell of dew permeating as it nibbled at his boots. How peaceful, the man thought, smiling as he turned to watch the log cabin behind him burn, the true source of the blood-red sky. As he turned, the screams from inside the home ceased, the man's sinister grin taking new meaning. The dark soul now possessing this human shell of skin, bone, and blood, pleased with his work. And he was sure those he served would be pleased as well. He watched until the sun would return in the eastern sky as the flames consumed the small cabin with an unnatural rage, until there was nothing left but smoldering ash, the occupant of the home silent. This is the third chapter in the Scarecrows series I've been writing. I'll leave a link in the description for the other two chapters. I wrote these so they could be watched in any order, so if you missed the other two, it's okay. You can continue this without missing anything. This one is from the point of view of Gideon Thorn, the mysterious caretaker of the land that would become known as the Barrett Farm, or Devil's Field. Subscribe and ring that bell for more horror stories. The land was a barren piece of wasteland, almost as if a desert had been carved into the center of lush fields and forests, a desert of clay and rock. The air hung heavy with the smell of sulfur. The vegetation that would try to take root in this forbidden ground would rot from the inside, turning a charred black and withering away. For 1,000 years, the tribes inhabiting the surrounding area knew this was unholy ground and stayed away, warning their offspring of the dangers, yet leading their enemies into a trap within its borders. None who would enter, man nor beast, would come out. So the ground sat empty for 1,000 years, save for the howling of the dark spirits guarding the land, awaiting their next meal of flesh, bone, and soul. After performing a certain ritual for 3 days to ease the suffering of the land, night fell over the Lakota tribe. In the distance, they could hear the herd of buffalo become agitated and begin stampeding away from the area. The herd, being their main source for food and migration, was leaving the area much sooner in the season than normal. The ground rumbled beneath the feet of the tribe as one warrior looked into the dark horizon to see a storm moving in, unlike any experienced in this area. Lightning bolts flashed across the sky. The blackest of clouds roared in as rain could be seen through the darkness approaching quickly. The electric energy spreading through the night sky. If the visual warnings were a sign of things to come, the Lakota people were in for a night full of fear. However, they watched in disbelief as the storm abruptly stopped over the Forbidden Land, holding its torrential fury on the desolate ground. Horses whinnied and wolves howled throughout the night. The next morning, the air had a crispness to it. The sky was devoid of any cloud, and the sun was bright, hovering just above the horizon, giving the plains a warm look that contrasted the bitterness biting into the bones of man and animal, peaceful yet unsettling. The chief sent scouts to the edges of the Forbidden Land. There, the two men saw destruction. The ground was flooded into a muddy mix. There was an overwhelming sense of despair hanging heavy in the air, even outside the borders. Fear and anger was ever present, and it seemed to seep from the very soil. They watched as a lone, lost buffalo entered the grounds, with water reaching the beast's knees. The animal became stuck in the mud and struggled tirelessly to break free. But as the two men watched in horror, they witnessed the buffalo become devoured from the bottom to top, falling onto its side into the murky water. It let out a scream that seemed to pierce the hearts of the two warriors. Then they watched, unable to look away, as if something were holding them witness to the deadly act, as the buffalo began deteriorating before their very eyes. Clumps of fur and meat ripped from the animal's body as it screamed terribly. Once the animal was completely consumed by whatever was beneath the surface, the trance was over. The warriors were free. The two men galloped on horseback as fast as the wind would carry them. As they reached their tribe, both man and horse exhausted, they relayed their discovery to the tribal elders. The land, while spirits don't seem to walk it anymore, is still full of bad omens. The next day, the tribe left the area to find the herd. It wasn't until they found the buffalo many days away that the energy of the Forbidden Land was lifted. In the desolate plains, the water receded, with all evil vanquished into the very soil of the land, save for one. One dark spirit remained to wander the flatland. However, the soil became rich. Plant life began to flourish. The ground had turned from a wet clay to an arid dark brown, life-giving, nutrient-rich soil. The lone dark spirit, who was as real as any man alive, leaned down and placed his black hand into the soil. Feeling the camaraderie of the dark energy below the surface, the trapped demons waiting for their time to rise again, a chance to feed on life. Many decades passed and new travelers began expanding westward, humans who were not warned about the dangers of the forbidden grounds, people who would bring with them seeds and livestock. The first of these men was a trapper named Horatio. He saw how plentiful the ground was and decided to build a single-room cabin on it. This would be a perfect place to set up a home base, then land to retire on when he was too old to continue his trade. All the while, the demon understanding that it would take flesh to raise the rest of his kind, human flesh. He watched from the tree line as Horatio cut trees and built his meager home. He watched as the man tempted fate over and over. The years of vegetation severing the connection of demon and the much-needed life on the surface. The demon watched, waited, hoping the ground would open up and swallow the man whole, but it didn't. Frantic, the demon loomed over the trapper's home at night, entering the cabin when Horatio was off on the trails, feeling the life that could be his own. Not not the things acquired in the cabin, but the physical energy seeping from everything Horatio touched. The demon fed on it. It made him stronger. One evening, Horatio returned to find the demon skulking around the land, a black silhouette against the blue-black evening sky, lurching, as if to be moving in jerks and leaps. Unnatural. Neither Horatio nor the dark figure releasing their eyes' grip on one another. Horatio, a man who had been through many dangers, pulled out his gun and fired it at the demon, not knowing exactly what he was shooting at. The demon flinched, then sped towards Horatio with a motion that seemed twisted and not of this earth. Yet his features were no more discernible the closer he got, the dark, hollow eyes being the only thing he could make out, and it terrified Horatio. The closer the entity progressed, the stronger the smell of ash and death that followed. Horatio fired another shot with no success, then hastily retreated into his cabin, slamming and barricading the door behind him just as a thud shook the door, as if a large man had pounded his entire body against it. Over and over the pounding continued as wood began to splinter. Horatio could see something in one crack, a deep, hollow eye staring at him, the beast growling with the sound of a frothing mouth. Horatio shook uncontrollably as he stepped backwards against the wall, still facing the door. Then, silence. Dead silence. Not even a footstep could be heard coming from outside, nor the sound of any breath from within the cabin. Then, the fire within the hearth let off a light as brilliant as the sun just before it returned to a dull glow. Inside the flames, Horatio could see the shape of something. The demon. As it lurched toward Horatio, it let off a terrible sound like an angry wind, then disappeared. But Horatio could feel the dark spirit within the cabin and the smell of rot and decay, unable to pinpoint its precise location, when all at once he felt the icy hands forcing him to the floor by his shoulders, hook-like fingers digging into his skin, piercing through him and into the floorboards beneath him. The twisted, dark face drooling over him like a rabid animal, dripping onto Horatio's face. The shadow's fingers breaking off inside him and keeping Horatio pinned to the floor as the demon stood and loomed over him with a darkness that seemed to engulf the room. A fire started within a small flicker. The fingers, which had become nails crucifying Horatio to the floor, began burning. Horatio screamed as his body slowly began to burn, starting with his shoulders. The demon, pleased with himself, left the cabin with movement that seemed to defy logic, jerking, twisting, contorting with every step, leaving Horatio to writhe uncontrollably on the floor. When he got outside, he turned to see the ground light up with the flames now suffocating the cabin. He grinned as he looked onto the horizon, knelt down and drove his now human fingers into the soil. The screams permeated from the cabin. It had been so long since the demon had heard this sound that he held it as an echo in his mind, exciting his very core. The screams stopped and the now human form turned to watch the cabin burn to ash and cinder, his face lit in the approaching sunlight. But now he was recognizable. His face was that of Horatio. Through the years following, few men had ventured into the forbidden land, the Devil's Field. But those who did were greeted by the demon, now calling himself Gideon Thorn. Each man met a similar fate of fire and brimstone, but no sacrifice was able to release the trapped demons beneath the ground's surface. It wasn't until a man moved onto the land with his wife and son that he realized what must be done. Elias Barrett and his family found the land while traveling west. The ground was as fertile as anything Elias had ever seen in Europe before making the move to America for a new life. He had heard the dangers of moving westward through the untamed country, mostly indigenous peoples who were not particularly pleased with the encroaching white man. But for Elias, it was worth the risk. Elias, his son Anton, and his wife Helga worked tirelessly over the course of a year to build a farmhouse on this cursed ground, unknowing of the stories whispered among those traveling through the area. All the while, Gideon Thorn watched from the tree line as the new home was erected. Eager to gain the upper hand, he waited until the perfect moment to introduce himself, a moment when the family was comfortable in their new false security. One evening, Gideon approached Elias in the fields as dusk bled into night, the sky a bruised purple fading into darkness. Elias stood among the rows of young corn, their stalks reaching skyward, full of promise and hope. "Evening, friend." Gideon, his voice smooth as silk, with a warmth that seemed to melt into the chilly air. Elias glanced up, studying the stranger with an uneasy curiosity. There was something familiar about the man, though. Elias could not place why, though. "Evening," he replied cautiously, nodding in a greeting. Gideon's face twisted into a friendly smile. "Couldn't help but notice the fine work you're doing here," he said, gesturing to the fields. "The land's a harsh mistress, but you've managed to tame her." Elias nodded, pride glinting in his eyes. "Takes hard work and faith," he replied, his voice steady. "Land rewards those who respect her." Gideon tilted his head, his eyes gleaming with a dark amusement that Elias couldn't see. "Respect, yes, but also protection." He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Have you heard of the old ways? Of charms that keep the land safe from the things that linger in the dark?" Elias frowned, the words unsettling him in a way he couldn't quite explain. "I'm not one for superstitions," he replied through a shadow flickered across his face. "Superstition or not," Gideon said, his voice smooth as oil, "there's power in symbols in the things we craft with our own hands. If you wish to keep your land truly safe, there's a ritual you could follow. Simple, really. A scarecrow to watch over your fields, but not just any scarecrow. This one must be bound to the soil, driven deep into the earth to root out anything unwanted." Elias hesitated, but Gideon's words had taken root, twisting through his mind like the creeping tendrils of a weed. After a long moment, he nodded. "Tell me what I need to do." Together, they crafted the scarecrow under Gideon's careful instruction. They gathered old withered wood, wrapped it in a tattered burlap, and stuffed it with straw. The figure they created was tall and hollow-eyed, with limbs too long, hands ending in sharp points, and a head that lolled at an unnatural angle. Elias felt a sick unease as he looked at it, but Gideon's words echoed in his mind, and he pressed on. He was a man of God, but maybe this untamed land could benefit from a little superstition. What could it hurt? The moon was high, casting a cold silvery light over the field as Elias carried the scarecrow to the heart of the land. Gideon walked beside him in silence, his eyes fixed on the figure with a hunger that made Elias's skin crawl. "Now," Gideon instructed, handing Elias a rusted iron pole, "drive it deep into the earth. Make it part of the land. Only then will it hold its power." Elias took the spike, feeling its unnatural cold bite into his skin. He knelt, positioning the scarecrow over the soil, and with one powerful motion, he drove the spike down, piercing through straw and burlap, anchoring the scarecrow firmly into the ground. The moment the spike hit the earth, a tremor rippled through the soil, a low guttural sound rising up from beneath, as if the land itself was groaning. The wind picked up, hissing through the fledgling cornstalks, and the air grew thick with the scent of decay, a cloying, sickly sweetness that turned Elias's stomach. He turned to Gideon, fear creeping into his gaze. What's happening? Gideon only smiled, his face twisting into a mask of triumph. His eyes gleamed, the darkness within them now barely contained, as if some ancient hunger had finally found satisfaction. He took a step back, watching with grim satisfaction as the scarecrow began to sink, as if the earth were swallowing it inch by inch. The groaning sound from below grew louder, more insistent, and Elias felt the ground shift beneath him, as if something was stirring, awakening. He stumbled back, his heart pounding, every instinct screaming at him to flee, but his legs refused to move. It was as though the earth itself held him there, trapping him in place as the ritual he'd unwittingly completed continued to unfold. When it was all over, the scarecrow stood tall with a solemn presence that unnerved Elias as he was able to move again. Elias turned to Gideon. "Leave, and don't let me catch you around here again." Gideon chuckled and walked away, disappearing into the tree line. Elias grabbed the cold metal pole anchoring the scarecrow to the ground and pulled with all his might. But the scarecrow wouldn't so much as wobble. It had become a permanent fixture to the field. 2 weeks later, Elias's son Anton went missing, lured in the middle of the night from his sleep in a meditative state to the scarecrow. Anton, still in a dream state, had visions of his father and mother burning at the site where the horrifying scarecrow stood. It was so real that he could smell them burning. Anton rushed to put on his boots and hurried through the front door of the farmhouse. In the distance, he could see 2 figures burning and screaming in the cornfield, with the scarecrow watching over them in excitement. The closer he got, the less intense the fire became, until he reached the spot where his parents should have been. Pulled from his dazed slumber, Anton was met with the presence of Gideon Thorn and the scarecrow. Anton tried to run, but the ground seemed to hold his feet in place. The smell of rot constricted his windpipes with the taste of fire. However, he was locked in place to the ground, restraining him in a thick, black sludge that hardened around his boots. The sludge crept up into his boots, binding his feet in place, slowly moving up his legs as it hardened around him. Gideon Thorn held his hand over Anton's mouth with a devious smile as he stared into Anton's eyes, watching him take his final breath as the slurry completely smothered the young man. Gideon watched in absolute amusement as Anton's spirit was pulled into the scarecrow. Along with it, up from the ground came a dark spirit and joined Anton's soul in the scarecrow, combining them and binding Anton to this once lifeless monstrosity constructed by his own father. The black sludge fell to the ground, seeping back into the very soil, leaving only Anton's bones collapsing before Gideon's feet in the pale moonlight. Gideon gathered up Anton's remains and carried them to the edge of the field and dropped the bones on the ground. It didn't take long before the bones were swallowed by the soil, removing any trace that Anton had ever been there. It didn't take long for Gideon to relieve the farmhouse of Elias and his wife Helga either, and 2 more wicked scarecrows watched over the field. To this day, it's said that if you walk the fence of the old Barrett farm, you can still see Gideon lurking from the tree line just outside the field, and at night, you can see the silhouettes of the scarecrows coming to life, ripping themselves from their pole and moving in twisted, jerking motions as they contort. Thank you for joining me in this story. This is the 3rd part to my Scarecrow series, and it's written in a way that it can be watched or listened to in any order. If you've enjoyed it or were terrified by it, leave a thumbs up and a comment. Also subscribe to the channel and ring the bell for notifications. Until the next time, this is Gerald reminding you to stay afraid.